Please be seated. In my family growing up, we were taught not to waste things. My mother would say, "Close the door, are you trying to heat the whole outdoors?" My father would say, "Don't pop so much popcorn, it's going to go to waste." I mean, it's not surprising that my parents would be real focused on not wasting things because they were that generation that grew up during the Great Depression. And their families didn't have much. And so they're very careful to reuse, recycle, make do, and not to waste things. So I can understand that. I remember once when my family went to Kenosha, Wisconsin to visit my Aunt Eloise and my Uncle Don. And we drove up there and we set up a tent in the backyard so we could sleep in the tent. And when it came time to go to bed, we came to the bathroom to brush our teeth. And so I took the tube of toothpaste and I put a great big fat line of toothpaste on my toothbrush, just like it shows in the commercials, you know. And from behind me, an arm came and grabbed the toothpaste and says, "You're wasting the toothpaste." It was my Uncle Don. "Sorry," I said. So we learned not to waste things. Don't waste time. Don't waste food. Don't waste money. It was like a duty, so it was immoral to waste things. We would say, "Look how much they threw away after their picnic. That's wasteful." It was a judgment on them. And we prided ourselves in not throwing things away if we couldn't help it. So it was a surprise to me many years later when I read this parable in the gospel today and realized that there's wastefulness going on here. You might call it the parable of the wasteful sower. I mean, don't you think that the sower is being wasteful in this parable? Throwing seeds everywhere, not just on the good ground, but on the path where it's all packed down and among the weeds and the rocky areas. I mean, why would a sower waste seed on the bad ground? It's just wasteful. I can just hear my mom, "Don't throw that seed over there. It's not going to grow there. Don't throw that seed in the weeds. That's not going to do any good. Don't waste that seed." But the sower in this parable sows the seed everywhere. So what kind of parable is this? I'm sure that the people who were listening to this parable were farmers. You know, this was a farming culture. Everyone farmed one way or the other. And they knew about sowing seeds. And they couldn't afford to waste good seed. They were poor people. They sowed just what they needed on the good soil so that they could have a good crop and have something to eat in the coming year. And now Jesus is telling them about a sower who's wasting the seed. And then he says at the end, the seed produces sometimes 100-fold, sometimes 60-fold, sometimes 30-fold. I mean, that means that for every seed that's planted, a stalk comes up that would have 100 grains in it, or 60 grains, or 30 grains. I mean, the normal yield would be like 4 or 5 grains a stalk, maybe 10. I mean, how could a stalk even hold 100 grains without falling over? This is a crazy amount of yield that Jesus is talking about. I mean, no one's going to believe this. I mean, you waste your seed and then you have a fantastic harvest after all that? 100, 60, 30-fold? How can that be? You mean it pays to be wasteful? Well, obviously Jesus is not teaching them about farming. They didn't come to learn about how to farm. They came to learn about God. And what Jesus is teaching them is that God is generous. God spreads his seed everywhere. God sows extravagantly. God sows generously. God sows prodigally. Now, if I was a farmer listening to Jesus, I think I would be delighted with this parable. I mean, I have to scrimp on seed, but God doesn't scrimp. The scribes in the temple, they watch every penny. They say, did you pay your temple tax? Did you pay every penny? Did you keep the commandments? Did you keep every one? They're not being generous. But Jesus is saying God is not like that. God is generous. God is wasteful. God makes the sun to shine on the righteous and the unrighteous alike. God makes the rain to fall on the just and the unjust alike. God is generous. God isn't stingy. God is full of grace and mercy. God forgives. The poor farmers who are listening to Jesus, I think, are just delighted with this message. It's good news to them. I think what Jesus is really talking about in this parable is generosity. Didn't Jesus go around healing people and pronouncing forgiveness? He didn't ask whether they were worthy of it or give them some text. He just gave it out freely. You're forgiven. Your sins are forgiven. He was generous, like the sower in the parable. So I think what Jesus is saying in this parable is God is generous, so you be generous too. Be generous with your time. Be generous with your money. Be generous with your forgiveness. Don't be stingy. If you're generous somehow, it'll all come back to you somehow, and even more. That's what it's about. I don't know why so many religious people seem to be so worried about who's going to get into heaven and who's not. I mean, there's not like a shortage of salvation that God's trying to deal out to different people. There's plenty of salvation. God is generous. About a year after I was called to be the vicar of a church in Oregon, we found out that the front wall of the church was rotting out and was going to need to be replaced. The name of the church was St. Andrew's, but it had this stained glass window in the front of the church, front wall of the church, which is a picture of St. Cecilia, the patron saint of music. And what had happened was many years before, one of the couples in the church had been on vacation to Canada, and they stopped at this antique store, and they found this beautiful stained glass window of St. Cecilia. And they said, oh, we got to buy this. So they bought it, put it in the back of the truck, brought it home, they cut a hole in the wall, and they put this window in there. The vicar was a little skeptical. He says, this is not the Church of St. Cecilia. This is the Church of St. Andrews. Well, it didn't matter. They still wanted that stained glass window. Everybody loved it. Trouble was, they didn't put any flashing underneath the window. So when the rain came, and there's a lot of rain there, it would go down the window, and then it would get into the wood underneath it, and it rotted out the wall and the sill there. So now, many years later, we were faced with this rotten wall. So got a contractor to come, and he gave an estimate, $15,000. And I'm thinking, $15,000? Where are we going to come up with that? I mean, we can barely make the budget. Well, a little before then, we had a new couple come to church, Charlie and Terry Pennington. And Charlie took an interest in this stained glass window and this rotten wall. And he talked with a contractor and, asked what was needed and everything. And He also talked to Betty and Pete Peterson. Now, Betty and Pete, they were like the matriarch and the patriarch of this church. They'd been there forever, and they'd helped build that church back in the 1950s. The local sawmill gave them a few truckloads of free lumber, and they built this themselves. So they talked about what they were going to do. And we called a meeting, and we explained to everyone what needed to be done. And Charlie got up. He said, now, we need $15,000 to fix this wall. And nobody else is going to do it for us. It has to be done. So Terry and I have decided that we'll give $5,000 if the rest of you will come up the rest. So I'm challenging you right now to make a commitment to help pay for this wall. There's silence. Pete Peterson got up and says, Betty and I will give $3,000. Somebody else said, we'll give $2,000. By the time the meeting was over, we had pledges for the whole $15,000. It was amazing. Well, Charlie and Terry were generous people. Whenever we had a need in that church, they would step up and they would say, well, we'll help out with this. And because they were generous, other people became more generous too. They were an example to people, and it just created an atmosphere in that church that, we're in this together, we can share. Generosity. Generosity isn't a matter of how much you can give. Some people can give a lot, some people can give a little. Generosity is an attitude. I mean, it's a mindset. We can be generous with our smiles, be generous with our time. We can be generous with our laughter. We can be generous with our praise of others. I mean, God is generous. And if God is generous to us, then why can't we be generous to others?